An independent research organization in California known as the Stanford Research Institute contracted to study psychic phenomena under laboratory conditions. The fact is that in this field that has been plagued with frauds and charlatans, many serious people at many prestigious centers of learning in this country and abroad are spending their time investigating further in this provocative field of study.
Theory. Concept. As will be explained in greater detail below, remote viewing theory postulates a non-material matrix in which any and all information about any person, place, or thing may be obtained through the agency of a hypothesized signal line. The viewer psychically perceives and decodes this signal line and objectifies the information so obtained. A remote viewing session consists of both the interaction of a remote viewer with the signal line and the interaction between the viewer and the monitor. The monitor and viewer are generally seated at opposite ends of a table. The viewer has a pen and plenty of paper in front of him or her. The monitor observes the viewer and determines when the viewer is ready to begin when the viewer places his or her pen on the left side of the paper in preparation to record the coordinates. The monitor then reads the coordinate, the viewer writes it, and the session proceeds from that point according to theory and methodology as discussed at length below. Definitions. Matrix. Something within which something else originates or takes form or develops. A place or point of origin or growth. Signal. Something that incites into action an immediate cause or impulse. In radio propagation theory, the carrier wave that is received by the radio or radar receiving set. Signal line. The hypothesized train of signals emanating from the matrix, discussed below, and perceived by the remote viewer, which transports the information obtained through the remote viewing process. Wave. A disturbance or variation that transfers itself in energy progressively from point to point in a medium or in space in such a way that each particle or element influences the adjacent ones, and that may be in the form of an elastic deformation or of a variation of level or pressure, of electric or magnetic intensity, of electric potential, or of temperature. Aperture. An opening or open space, hole, gap, cleft, chasm, slit. In radar, the electronic gate that controls the width and dispersion pattern of the irradiating signal or wave. Gestalt. A unified whole, a configuration, pattern, or organized field having specific properties that cannot be derived from the summation of its component parts. Evoking. Evoke. To call forth or up. To summon. To call forth a response, elicit. Iteration of the coordinate or alternate prompting method is the chasm which evokes the signal line, calling it up, causing it to impinge on the autonomic nervous system and unconsciousness for transmittal through the viewer and on to objectification, discussed at length in structure. Coding, encoding, decoding. The information conveyed on the signal line is encoded, that is translated into an information system a code, allowing data to be transmitted by the signal line. Upon receiving the signal, the viewer must decode this information through proper structure to make it accessible. This concept is very similar to radio propagation theory, in which the main carrier signal is modulated to convey the desired information. Discussion. The matrix has been described as a huge, non-material, highly structured, mentally accessible framework of information containing all data pertaining to everything in both the physical and non-physical universe. In the same vein as Jung's cosmic unconsciousness, the matrix is open to and comprises all conscious entities as well as information related to everything else living or non-living by accepted human definition. It is the informational framework from which the data encoded on the signal line originates. This matrix can be envisioned as a vast, three-dimensional geometric arrangement of dots, each dot representing a discrete information bit. Each geographic location on the Earth has a corresponding segment of the matrix corresponding exactly to the nature of the physical location. When the viewer is prompted by the coordinate or other targeting methodology, he or she accesses the signal line for data derived from the matrix. By successfully acquiring or detecting this information from the signal line, then coherently decoding it through his or her conscious awareness and faculties, makes it available for analysis and further exploitation by themselves or others. Remote viewing is made possible through the agency of a hypothetical signal line. In a manner roughly analogous to standard radio propagation theory, this signal line is a carrier wave which is inductively modulated by its intercourse with the information and may be detected and decoded by a remote viewer. This signal line radiates in many different frequencies, and its impact on the viewer's perceptive faculties is controlled through a phenomenon known as aperture. Essentially, when the remote viewer first detects the signal line in stage 1, it manifests itself as a sharp, rapid influx of signal energy, representing large gestalts of information. In this situation, we therefore speak of a narrow aperture, since only a very narrow portion of the signal line is allowed to access the consciousness. In later stages involving longer, slower, more enduring waves, the aperture is spoken of as being wider. Note, for the sake of clarity, ease of instruction, and faculty of control, RV methodology is divided into discrete progressive stages, each dealing with different and more detailed aspects of the sight. Stage 1 is the first and most general of the 6 stages thus far identified. Each stage is a natural progression, building on the information obtained during the previous stage. Each session must start with stage 1, progress through stage 2, stage 3, and so forth, through the highest stage to be complete in that particular session. Levels of consciousness. Definitions. Subconscious. Existing in the mind but not immediately available to consciousness. Affecting thought, feeling, and behavior without entering awareness. The mental activities just below the threshold of consciousness. Subliminal. Existing or functioning outside the area of conscious awareness. Influencing thought, feeling, or behavior in a manner unperceived by personal or subjective consciousness. Designed to influence the mind on levels other than that of conscious awareness, and especially by presentation too brief to be consciously perceived. Lemon. The Threshold of consciousness, the interface between the subconscious and conscious. Liminal, at the limen, verging on consciousness. Supraliminal, above the limen, in the realm of conscious awareness. Conscious, perceiving, apprehending, or noticing with a degree of controlled thought or observation, recognizing as something external, present especially to the senses, involving rational power, perception, and awareness. By definition, the conscious part of the human being is that portion of the human consciousness which is linked most closely to and limited by the material world. Autonomic nervous system, or ANS. A part of the vertebrate nervous system that invertebrates smooth and cardiac muscle and glandular tissues, governs actions that are more or less automatic and consists of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Ideogram. The reflexive mark made on the paper as a result of the impingement of the signal on the autonomic nervous system and its subsequent transmittal through this system to the arm and hand muscles, which transfers it through the pen onto the paper. Analytic overlay, or AOL. Conscious subjective interpretation of signal line data, which may or may not be relevant to the site. Discussed at length in structure. Automatic versus autonomic. Reception and movement of the signal line information through the viewer's system and into objectification is an autonomic process as opposed to an automatic one, which itself implies an action arising and subsiding entirely within the system rather than from without. Note, when the word system is used without qualifiers such as automatic, etc., it refers in a general sense to all the integrated and integrative biological and perhaps metaphysical as well elements and components of the viewer, him or herself, which enable them to function in this mode known as remote viewing. Discussion. Our view theory relies on a rather Freudian model of human conscious levels. The lowest level of consciousness is paradoxically named the unconscious. All this label really means is that part of our mental processes we know as physical awareness or consciousness does not have access to what is going on there. It is apparently this part of the individual's psyche that first detects and receives the signal line. From here, it is passed to the autonomic nervous system. When the signal line impinges on the ANS, the information is converted into a reflexive nervous response conducted through muscular channels controlled by the ANS. If so allowed, this response will manifest itself as an ideogram. At the same time, the signal is passed up through the subconscious, across the limen, and into the lower fringes of the consciousness. This is the highest state of consciousness from the standpoint of human material awareness. However, the normal waking consciousness poses certain problems for remote viewing, occasioned largely because of the linear analytic thought processes which are societally enhanced and ingrained from our earliest stages of cognitive development. While extremely useful in a society relying heavily on quantitative data and technological development, such analytic thinking hampers remote viewing by the manufacture of what is known as analytic overlay, or AOL. As the signal line surges up across the limen and into the threshold areas of consciousness, the mind's conscious analytic process feels duty-bound to assign coherence to what at first blush seems virtually incomprehensible data coming from an unaccustomed source. It must, in other words, make a logical assessment based on the impressions being received. Essentially, the mind jumps to one or a number of instantaneous conclusions about the incoming information without waiting for sufficient information to make an accurate judgment. This process is completely reflexive and happens even when not desired by the individual involved. Instead of allowing holistic right brain processes through which the signal line apparently manifests itself to assemble a complete and accurate concept, untrained left brain-based analytic processes seize upon whatever bit of information seems most familiar and forms an AOL construct based on it. For example, a viewer has been given the coordinates to a large steel girder bridge. A flash of a complex metal man-made structure may impinge on the liminary regions of the viewer's mind, but so briefly that no coherent response can be made to it. The conscious mind, working at a much greater speed than the viewer expects, perceives bits and pieces, such as angles, riveted girders, and a sense of being roofed over and paved. Whereupon it suggests to the physical awareness of the viewer that the site is the outside of a large sports stadium. The image is, of course, wrong, but it is at least composed of factual elements, though these have been combined by the viewer's over-ear analytical processes to form an erroneous conclusion. Learning theory. Definitions. Overtraining. The state reached when the individual's learning system is oversaturated and is burned out. Analogous to a muscle that has been overworked and can no longer extend or contract until it is allowed to rest and rebuild fibers that would have been broken down by the stress, or reinforce those that have been newly acquired by new demands placed upon the muscle. Absorption. Assimilation, as by incorporation or by the digestive process. Cognitron. A cognitron is an assemblage of neurons linked together by interconnecting synapses, and which, when stimulated by the mind's recall system, produce a composite concept of their various subparts. Each neuron is charged with an element of the overall concept, which, when combined with the elements of its fellow neurons, produces the final concept which the cognitron represents. As a human learns new facts, skills, or behaviors, neurons are connecting into new cognitrons, the connecting synapses of which are more and more reinforced with use. Neuron. A nerve cell with all its processes. The apparent fundamental physical building block of mental and nervous processes. Neurons are the basic element in the formation of cognitrons and may be linked into varying configurations by the formation or rearrangement of synapse chains. Synapse. The interstices between neurons over which nerve impulses must travel to carry information from the senses, organs, and muscles to the brain and back, and to conduct mental processes. Learning curve. The graphic representation of the standard success to session ratio of a remote viewer trainee. The typical curve demonstrates high success for the first 1 to 2 or few attempts, a sudden and drastic drop in success, then a gradual improvement curve until a relatively high plateau is reached. First time effect. In any human activity or skill, a phenomenon exists known as beginner's luck. In remote viewing, this phenomenon is manifest as especially successful performance at the first attempt at psychic functioning, after which the success rate drops sharply. to be built back up again gradually through further training. This effect is hypothesized to result from the initial excitation of hereditary but dormant psi-inducing neuronal channels, which, when first stimulated by attempted psychoenergetic functioning, catch the analytic system off guard, as it were, allowing high-grade functioning with little other system interference. Once the initial novelty wears off, the analytic systems, which have been trained for years to screen all mental functions, attempt to account for and control the newly awakened neural pathways, thereby generating increasing amounts of masking, mental noise, or AOL. Noise. The effect of various types of overlay, inclemencies, etc., that serve to obscure or confuse the viewer's reception and accurate decoding of the signal line. Noise must be dealt with properly and in structure to allow the viewer to accurately recognize the difference between valid signal and his or her own incorrect internal process. Discussion. Learning theory for RV methodology is governed by the idea that the student should quit on a high point. Traditionally, the learning of a skill concentrates on rote repetition, reiterating the skill a large number of times until it is consistently performed correctly. Recent developments in learning theory, which have been applied with particular success in sports training methodology, indicate that the rote repetition concept tends more to reinforce incorrect performance as opposed to developing the proper behavior or skill. Much success has been realized by implementing the concept of quitting on a high point. That is, when a skill or behavior has been executed correctly, taking an extended break from the training at that point allows the learning processes to remember the correct behavior and strengthen the neurological relays that have been established in the brain by the correct procedure. The phenomenon of overtraining is a very real danger in the training cycle, generally brought about by the pushing ahead with training until the learning system of the viewer is totally saturated and cannot absorb any more. This results in system collapse, which in effect is a total failure to function psychically at all. To avoid this, the normal practice has been to work in appropriate number of sessions a day, anywhere from 1 to several, depending on each individual trainee's capacity and level of training and experience, for a set number of days or weeks, also individually dependent, with a layoff period between training periods to allow time for assimilation or absorption. Even with this precaution, overtraining can sometimes strike, and the only remedy becomes a total training layoff, then a gradual reintroduction. It is extremely important that the viewer inform the monitor when he or she is feeling especially good about their performance in remote viewing training, so that a training break may be initiated on this high point. To continue to push beyond this threatens a slide into overtraining. It is very important that should the viewer in the course of the training session become aware that he or she has experienced some important cognition or understanding, or if the monitor perceives that this is the case, the session must here also be halted. This allows time for both the cognition to be fully matriculated into the viewer's system and for the accompanying elation of discovery to dissipate. The fact that CRV methodology is arranged into 6 distinct stages implies that there is a learning progression from one stage to the next. To determine when certain milestones are looked for, though the peculiarities of each stage make certain of these criteria relevant only to that specific stage, general rules may still be outlined. When a viewer has consistently demonstrated control and replication of all pertinent stage elements and has operated noise-free, i.e. properly handling AOL and other system distractions in structure for 5 or 6 sessions, he or she is ready to write a stage summation essay and move on to the introductory lectures for the next stage. Essay writing is an important part of the CRB training and serves as a sort of intellectual objectification of the material learned. Through student essays, the instructor is able to demonstrate how thoroughly and accurately the student has internalized the concepts taught.